We also have to unlearn some lessons about solar. And in fact, one of them is, why on earth, after all these years, are we so stupid that we install solar panels connected together in series in a so-called daisy chain on our roofs? You don't have to do more than high school, not college, but high school physics to recognize this is absolutely stupid. And yet we routinely do it all the time. So we need to know why, and we need to figure out what to do differently. In fact, the panels are strung together in a series because for a long time the inverter to make AC power out of DC solar was expensive. So obviously you get one large inverter that converts your whole system. So that made sense in the 1950s and 60s. It does not make sense today. Who in the room has a cell phone? I won't ask who has two, but anyone who has a cell phone has the technology to change that system. The power electronics just in here is essentially enough to allow you to connect each of your solar panels to your meter directly and produce AC power from each panel. And why does that matter? It matters because of what you see here. I won't point at the screens, they're large and far away. But you'll notice that on this snapshot of my roof, here we have some panels, the blue ones, generating a lot of power, and a number of panels producing very little power. When you hook them all in a series, the worst performing panel, whether it's shaded or broken or covered with bird droppings, produces little power, and it brings down the output of the whole array. The technology in your cell phone allows you to switch that, and so in fact, if you compare the output of an array with a traditional inverter, the blue, versus these microinverters, the red, you see that you get, in this case, in two examples, 10 to 30% more power out for a lower cost because the smaller inverters are cheaper. That's a massive increase only achieved by recognizing that the way we did things in the 50s and 60s doesn't make sense for solar today. It's a huge innovation. Let me scale up a little bit. California signed the Global Warming Solutions Act, a typically grandiose California name, but with good reason. This calls for a return to our 1990 emission levels by 2020, not quite the Kyoto Protocol, but a reasonable step forward. And in fact, there was great criticism. There was no way to get this done. Other innovations have come along, including support for solar, the changing market, and this aggressive policy measure. In fact, California has rapidly ramped up the amount of installed solar, so much so that you can see the trend lines were now at the 0.5 gigawatt level in 2008. The 2009 number is 3 gigawatts, and the 2010 forecast is over 20,000 megawatts, 20 gigawatts of new power. All of that is already scheduled on the books. The fraction that gets built with this crisis, we'll see, but it's a remarkable change, a truly remarkable change. And in fact, it's empowered California to think very differently. One feature of California thinking differently is that California embraced a 2050 target, as some other nations have done, of an 80% reduction in emissions. And in fact, with the election in the United States, and with this much greater dialogue on what to do, I'll take the California picture and scale it up. This is historic US greenhouse gas emissions. This is what I hope we no longer call business as usual, but business as business as something else. This is the Bush administration's intensity target and the Kyoto Protocol that we're not going to hit. This, however, is the plan endorsed by President Obama. It's essentially the same as the California plan. It calls for that return to 1990 levels by about 2020, and then this deep dive down to the IPCC, the 80% or so reduction levels by 2050. Some of the new mechanisms that are being used by a number of politicians, business leaders to argue for it is one of the features that is transitory but important in the short term, and that is that there is a jobs dividend by investing green. That jobs dividend will decline over time, but in the beginning, it's a powerful political force, and it can generate jobs in some key areas. And in fact, this has been one of the most overused but interesting first lessons of the Green Revolution. Now I'm going to highlight one last and short technical story. I'm not going to give you the details of this model, but our laboratory has produced a model of the grid in the western United States that has essentially every power plant and every transmission line. And we build new transmission and storage. And I want to highlight just the result that you see by looking at the map of California. This model actually shows in green existing transmission lines. And the critical feature is the purple. The purple is that if one were to be the energy czar, as many people in California think they are, unfortunately, and you were to build optimally based on lowest cost reaching various climate targets, what we know here is something critically important. Without building some critical new transmission infrastructure, the purple lines, you actually can't get to your targets. We need to enable with infrastructure technologies required to build out new wind, new geothermal, new solar thermal, etc. In fact, with a relatively moderate amount of new transmission build, we find that clean energy targets, more than 50% actually are possible in California's future. And in fact, there's an interesting lesson. What I've plotted here is the fraction of new energy that comes from various sources as a function of the price of carbon. It goes from no price of carbon to a price of carbon of $200 a ton. A remarkable piece of the story is that in a place like California or in Southern Europe and a variety of areas endowed with a great deal of renewables, the price of carbon is important to enable things. But the price of carbon has very little impact unless you build that infrastructure. Look at how flat that distribution is. It's critical that you build out the capacity. That truly gets you to a point where even a modest price of carbon helps to tip the balance. And we'll argue later on about what mechanism is best to get there and what price of carbon. But what this says is there are a number of places that can go exceedingly far, even with a low price of carbon, if in fact they enable it. So it's the systems science, the systems economics, the systems engineering that's critical. In fact, more critical than, I would argue, the micro detail to some of the policies. Now I'm going to skip over, but just highlight because it's on the agenda, the issue of biofuels. We'll come back to this in a little bit tomorrow to look at some of the assessment techniques. But without the quantitative assessments of which biofuels are good and bad, we wouldn't know where to go in the policy framework. It's a critical part of the story, and again, I'll return to that one tomorrow. But I'm going to end with the feature I mentioned before, and that is the need for financial innovation. We're talking now finally about the details of which pricing mechanism for carbon is critical, and I've argued that it is critical, but that in fact other features have a huge role. And I'll give one example of a fledgling program. This was actually started in my hometown in Berkeley, California, and it notes the following simple fact. How many of us would have a cell phone if we had to pay for 20 years worth of minutes up front, no matter what the subsidies and the deals on the phone are? So what the city of Berkeley has done, and now more than 1,000 cities have inquired about how to do versions of it, is to loan money to property owners so that they can invest in efficiency only, or efficiency and solar, but not simply solar, and pay it back over 20 years on your property taxes. And in fact, that property tax payment goes with the property, not with the individual. You build clean energy equity in your dwellings. In fact, the challenges we're seeing now are how to extend this to low-income families, to renters, to share the revenues between renters and the property owner, perhaps. And in fact, the list right now of US cities that has adopted this is over 10 today. The Berkeley program started 2 months ago. 10 today, and again, we have over 1,000 serious inquiries. We need many, many more examples of these kinds of clean energy innovations to get where we're going. This is one, and what I hope we'll discuss in the rest of the session today, and some of the sessions later on this afternoon and the closing tomorrow, is how to essentially replicate these models tremendously widely. Thank you very much.